Welcome. In this session of IntelliQuest's The World's 100 Greatest Books, you'll become acquainted with an American writer who had a profound effect on authors, poets, thinkers, and philosophers of his day. A writer who is considered the leading exponent of American Transcendentalism, the spokesman for the Romantic poets, and the most important figure of the American Romantic period. His name is Ralph Waldo Emerson, and his work influenced some of the greatest men and women of his age, and continues to be a source of inspiration for modern humanity. Emerson was the first distinctively New England author to become prominent in American literature. After him, that area of our country would become a rich spawning ground for novelists, poets, and other writers whose works helped define a regional and a national culture. He was a friend and advisor to his contemporary writers, and sometimes gave them financial support, as in the case of poet A. Bronson Alcott. He had important relationships with the literature luminaries of his time, both here and in Europe, including Wordsworth, Coleridge, Carlyle, Hawthorne, and of course Henry David Thoreau. Every now and then in the history of literature, we come across a great writer whose life and work is deeply connected with that of another great writer. Theirs was a partnership of minds, a friendship of ideas and ideals, a pairing in which the individual achievements of one can't be separated from the achievements of the other. Coleridge and Wordsworth were one such partnership, and Emerson and Thoreau were another. Emerson and Thoreau were intellectual companions and neighbors in Concord, Massachusetts. Together, they were the leading exponents of the American Transcendental movement, a movement that experienced a popular revival in America during the counterculture days of the 1960s. In the 1830s, Emerson became a leader of the Transcendental movement, which questioned the established views of literature, philosophy, and religion. His first book, an essay called Nature, became the Bible of the Transcendentalists, and contains the seeds of the lifelong philosophy that would have such profound impact on Thoreau and other artists and thinkers of his time. For that reason, Nature is the featured work in this session. Transcendentalism is a broad term that has come to include many different philosophies that fall somewhat into the same category. American Transcendentalism had its roots in German philosophy, particularly Immanuel Kant, but it was Emerson who delineated and refined it. It's based chiefly on the search for truth or reality through spiritual intuition. It was a rejection of empiricism, the belief that knowledge is based on the perception of the senses, on experience and practice, or on the intellect. To prevent confusion, you should know that Emerson, oddly enough, referred to learning through intuition as reason, and to intellectual and rational learning as understanding. He didn't use reason in the way it's usually interpreted today, since it didn't imply to him a mental process, but the inspired, intuitive processes that he and other transcendentalists had such respect for. There are 4 points made in his essay Nature that are essential points in transcendentalism. They are: 1. There is knowledge beyond what we gain from the 5 senses. 2. Spirit is supreme over matter. 3. Nature is a source of joy and learning and should be revered. And 4. Materialistic goals conflict with spiritual learning, and so individuals must set high standards of conduct for themselves, which includes rejecting materialism. The word transcendental means basically what is beyond, and to attain what is beyond, Emerson believed people needed to go within. At the same time, they were to view what was outside them with insight and intuition. That is why he once stated that within and above are synonyms. Transcendentalism centers around the idea of the soul, that there is a soul, that it's superior to anything material, and that it's accessible. Here's how he describes that soul and how man's occupations and interests are related to it. There is one soul. It is related to the world. Art is its action thereon. Science finds its methods. Literature is its record. Religion is the emotion of reverence that it inspires. Ethics is the soul illustrated in human life. Society is the finding of the soul by individuals in each other. Trades are the learning of the soul in nature by labor. Politics is the activity of the soul illustrated in power. Manners are silent and mediate expressions of the soul. Emerson believed that the soul exists before birth and comes from afar or beyond. He believed there was a natural order in the universe, and that man does not impose that order, rather he follows it. He believed in self-reliance, in trusting oneself to find the soul or the truth. He believed in optimism, since he felt evil didn't exist. It's merely the absence of good. He believed in the importance of individual morality and integrity. And finally, he believed in the unity of humankind and nature, which he called the Oversoul. All these ideas were influential in forming the literature and philosophy of 19th century America. He was a particularly important force in poetry because he believed the poets were, in his words, liberating gods, or prophets, who could glimpse and express this soul because they operated chiefly from intuition rather than rational thought. He said of the poet that he is the sayer, the namer, and representative of beauty. Emerson developed this view partly from reading the Romantic poets, like Coleridge and Wordsworth, and in fact became the spokesman of the philosophy of the Romantic poets. His opinions about poetry and poets challenged the poetic conservatism of the times and inspired the experimental verse of poets like Walt Whitman, who once hailed Emerson as his master. Meanwhile, he inspired other transcendentalists like Thoreau and challenged authors like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville, who held dark, pessimistic views of the universe. The essay Nature, published in 1836, was Emerson's first serious attempt to build a system around his ideas. Although it lacks simplicity, and critics complain of how over-organized and abstract it is, it nevertheless contains the first outpourings of his experiences and thoughts. The main question the essay addresses is, to what end nature? What is nature? What is its structure, value, and purpose? How does it relate to man, and what can he learn from it? His conclusion was that nature functioned as a visible manifestation of invisible spiritual truths. The essay was the beginning of Emerson's proclamations to know yourself and to build your own world. Thoreau was so impressed with these ideas that he did just that, constructing and settling into his own personal world at Walden Pond. But Thoreau was far from the only one impressed by Emerson's pronouncements. At home and abroad, he was heralded as a man of insight and wisdom, whose ideas could inspire greater self-awareness and higher creativity. A look into the background and early experiences of Ralph Waldo Emerson gives us many clues as to how his ideas were formed and developed. He was born May 25, 1803, in Boston, and was descended from 5 generations of ministers, a tradition he would follow. He attended Boston Latin School between the ages of 9 and 14, and later entered Harvard Divinity School. His aunt, Mary Emerson, was an influence in his younger years, encouraging him, among other things, to write poetry. During his school years, he kept journals and sometimes won prizes for his essays. His journals, which would be the source for much of his work, have been printed and span a period of over 50 years. After completing his studies at Harvard, Emerson taught at a girls' school his brother directed, and then traveled to South Carolina and Florida to cure a case of tuberculosis, an illness which had long plagued his family. When he returned in 1829, he became pastor of the Second Unitarian Church in Boston. He was 26 years old. That same year, he married his first wife, Ellen Louisa Tucker, but she was always frail and died 2 years later in 1831. After her death, in the middle of a personal and religious crisis, Emerson decided he could no longer be a formal representative of the Unitarian Church. For one thing, he ceased to regard the Lord's Supper as a necessary rite. He resigned the ministry and sailed off for a tour of Europe. Emerson was 30 years old when he arrived in England. In Europe, he met some of the literary figures who would so deeply influence him. He formed relationships with Coleridge and Wordsworth, and a lifelong friendship with philosopher-historian Thomas Carlyle. He returned to America in 1834 and delivered a number of lectures on literature and philosophy in Boston, and published one anonymous book. This was also the year he married again, this time to Lydia Jackson, whom he called Lydian. In 1836, Emerson helped found the Transcendental Club and wrote the essay Nature, featured in the session. Emerson enjoyed the lecture circuit and began to appear in cities across the country. Many of his most famous ideas were presented at these lectures or in the form of addresses, and were later published in collections of essays. These included The American Scholar, given in 1837, and published in 1841 in a volume entitled Essays, First Series, and Nature, given in 1836, and also published in the 1841 volume. Other important works were Representative Man, Poems, English Traits, The Conduct of Life, and Self-Reliance. The American Scholar was originally delivered to the Phi Beta Kappa Society at Cambridge, and emerged as a manifesto for young American men to become, in Emerson's words, man-thinking. He called on them to trust their individuality and to scholars to act as representatives of a noble standard to their nation and to the world. His audience responded as if they were in the presence of a guru, and the success of this lecture launched a lifelong career in public speaking. Self-Reliance is a collection of thoughts and self-observations where Emerson calls on himself and others to trust themselves, and also cautions against self-distrust. He writes in that work that nothing can bring you peace but yourself. In Representative Man, he considers figures of the past he thought were most influential, including Plato, Swedenborg, Montaigne, Shakespeare, Napoleon, and Goethe. English Traits is a witty collection of ideas and impressions gathered in his travels, and The Conduct of Life is an essay that grew out of his anti-slavery lectures. After his lectures and travels, Emerson would return home to share ideas and conversation with his friends, among them the poet Bronson Alcott, novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne, and of course Henry David Thoreau. Their friendship is one of the most famous and productive in literary history. Emerson was 14 years older than Thoreau and served as his philosophical mentor. For example, Thoreau was so impressed with Emerson's essay, The American Scholar, that he adopted the life of meditation and study it idealized. In fact, he embraced these ideals so completely that he refused to take up a conventional vocation such as law, divinity, or teaching after graduating from Harvard. And it was Emerson's views on the sanctity of nature that led to Thoreau's famous stay on Walden Pond. Thoreau spent much time in the Emerson household, where he managed household affairs while Emerson was lecturing or traveling, and offered platonic companionship to Thoreau's wife, Lydian, to whom he was devoted. Emerson and Thoreau had a deep friendship, but it wasn't without its challenges. Thoreau had a very idealized view of friendship, thinking it was the ultimate transcendental relationship, that it was close to God, and that without it, nature was morally insignificant. He hoped the two could communicate on a higher plane, and could demonstrate to the world, in his words, what men can build each other up to be when both master and pupil work in love. Emerson's fault, meanwhile, was a tendency to be patronizing, and so the two sometimes had their frustrations with each other, as do most friends. Thoreau lived with the Emersons during two different periods, and these sojourns in an urban society are partially what convinced him to withdraw from the civilized world. Deciding that it was time to live his philosophy, he built a cabin on the shores of Walden Pond near Concord and lived there for 2 years. Thoreau was more of a doer or an activist than the thinker Emerson, and so the latter thought the former was a little too extreme, while the former found the latter too theoretical. There is a great deal more detailed information on the life of Henry David Thoreau in the Instant Expert session that features his work, Walden, based on his experiences and observations while living in his natural habitat by the pond. In 1840, Emerson became co-founder of the periodical for the Transcendental movement called Dial. He was editor from 1842 until its collapse in 1844. He traveled again to Europe from 1847 to 1848, and by 1850, now back in America, he had become known as the Sage of Concord. He continued to lecture and to release publications of current and early writings, mostly essays and poetry. In 1872, he left home again to travel the Mediterranean countries. He died in Concord on April 27, 1882, at the age of 79. The essay that launched his career and inspired a host of young philosophers and writers was, of course, Nature. Now, we'll review some of the key ideas and remarks that made that work such a seminal piece of literature. That is, a piece that planted the seeds for future ideas and for the entire transcendental movement in America. Nature begins with an introduction that claims most of our knowledge of the world is second-hand, including our knowledge of nature and God. Our age is an age that records everything in biographies, histories, and criticism. The generations that preceded us beheld God and nature face to face, but we instead rely on their written words as a substitute for our own experiences. He then asks the question that becomes central to the essay and to his entire philosophy, which is, why should we not also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should we not have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs? Then he goes on to speak of the value of experiencing nature. Nature, he maintains, is an image of wisdom. Therefore, it behooves man to know nature and to adjust his life to it. There is an absolute order to things, and that order is reflected in nature and can supply answers to the questioning mind. He comments, whatever the curiosity the order of things has awakened in our minds, the order of things can satisfy. If a man studies nature, he'll see that it reveals a design in its form and tendencies, and so that study will lead to a discovery of the design within man, and thereby to the truth within him. At the end of the introduction, Emerson defines nature this way. All that is separate from us, all which philosophy distinguishes as the not me, that is both nature and art, all other men and my own body, must be ranked under the name nature. He says there are two ways in which he uses the word nature. One is the common physical way, and the other is a philosophical way. The philosophical nature refers to a universe composed of nature and the soul. In other words, all that is not the soul can be viewed as nature. In the first section, Emerson begins by saying that to find solitude, man must retire not just from society, but from his own chamber, for he is not alone if he reads or writes. If a man would be alone, let him look at the stars. To Emerson, the best sort of solitude, the kind that encourages philosophical meditation, comes to man when he's alone with nature. For philosophical truths and the answers to man's questions emerge from the physical environment of nature. That environment brings, in his words, an integrity of impression made by manifold natural objects, and the man who is best at integrating all those parts is often the poet. In the woods, he says, a man can cast off his years and become a child, returning to intuition and faith. In the pure air and infinite space, we become nothing but a transparent eyeball which sees all, while the currents of the universal being circulate through us, and we become part and parcel of God. In the solitude of the fields, there is an occult relationship between man and vegetable. The winds that stir the trees are like higher thoughts and emotions coming over us. The power to produce such higher thoughts lies neither in nature nor in man separately, but in the harmony of both. Section 2 divides the purpose of the world into 4 different classes: commodity, beauty, language, and discipline. Then he describes what he means by the first, commodity. Under commodity, he lists all the conveniences and advantages supplied to us by nature. These include physical things like food and shelter and natural resources, and enriching things, or what he calls splendid ornaments, such as fresh air above, ocean beneath, and earth in between, with its zodiac of lights, its tent of dripping clouds, its climates, its beasts, its fire, and its stones. He admits that these commodities are of temporary and indirect benefit, while nature's service to the soul is ultimate. But there is still a lesson to learn from the perfection of nature's commodities. That lesson is order. The wind sows the seed, the sun evaporates the sea, the rain feeds the plant feeds the animal, and the cycle then nourishes man. It is both a process and a result, and the end is of great benefit, because man must eat if he is to work. Emerson then adds that the works of man, his occupations, inventions, and arts, are just reproductions of nature. Man produces steam, paves roads with iron bars, builds canals and bridges, and more. In the next section, Emerson discusses his second category of world purpose, beauty. Beauty, he says, is one of man's noblest and most ancient urges, and it too is served by nature. In fact, the ancient Greek word for beauty is cosmos, spelled with a K. The earth offers us sky, mountains, trees, and other such things that give the eye pleasure, which comes from outline, color, motion, and grouping. The aspects of natural beauty, he says, appear in 3 ways. One is the perception of natural forms, which refreshes and soothes us. As examples, Emerson says, the dawn is his Assyria, the sunset his Paphos, a broad noon is the England of his senses and understanding, night is his Germany of mystic philosophy and dreams. He states that contrary to what city folk believe, the country is pleasant not just in summer, but in all seasons, each providing a rich feast of scenery and landscape. Yet this beauty of nature that is seen and felt is one part, and the least important part of its beauty. Second is the spiritual beauty that arises in the combination of human will and nature. Beauty, he says, is the mark God sets upon virtue, and therefore it's a necessary component of perfection. When a noble deed is done in a scene of great natural beauty, the heroes are entitled to add the beauty of the scene to the beauty of their deeds. As examples, he cites Leonidas and his 300 martyrs, who die in Thermopylae, and the sun and moon come to look at them, and Arnold Winkelried in the high Alps gathering in his side a sheaf of Austrian spears. He says nature stretches out her arms to embrace man. Only let his thoughts be of equal greatness. A virtuous man is in unison with nature's works. The third aspect of beauty relates not to virtue, but to thought. For after man has perceived the beauty of the world, he may contemplate it, and then he may have the urge to reproduce it. This urge towards the creation of beauty is art. Beauty comes to the mind unbidden and is passive. It is a thing which Emerson says, doth only do, but not know. Man responds first with his senses and then, if so inclined, with intellect. The beauty of nature exists in its perfection and harmony. When man expresses this in his art, he produces an abstract or epitome of the world, the result or expression of nature in miniature. Artists try to extract this beauty in their own individual medium: painting, sculpture, music, poetry, or architecture. Emerson says, "Thus in art does nature work through the will of a man filled with the beauty of her first works." He believes that the love and desire for beauty is an ultimate end. There is no point in asking or giving a reason as to why man seeks beauty. He then refers to the Greek concept of cosmos, that the universe is beauty, and says God is the all-fair. Truth and goodness and beauty are but different faces of the same all. Thus the beauty of nature symbolizes inner and eternal beauty, and is a channel through which the soul can achieve oneness with God. The third way in which nature serves man is through language. The purpose of the universe is symbolized through words in three ways. Words are signs of natural facts. Certain natural facts symbolize certain spiritual facts, and nature itself is the symbol of spirit. The first category, words signify natural facts, means that every word used to express a moral or intellectual fact, if traced to its root, is found to be borrowed from some material appearance. For example, right means straight, wrong means crooked, spirit means wind, and transgression is crossing of the line. Emerson says every appearance in nature corresponds to a state of mind. This is the source of our similes, metaphors, and figures of speech, such as innocent as a lamb, firm as a rock, and angry as a lion. Also, ignorance and knowing are expressed by dark and light. Passion is heat. Hope is the visible distance before us. Emerson restates the link between man and nature as seen this time in language, because man cannot be understood without these objects of nature, nor these objects without him. Emerson then tells us that if we go back in history, we find that language gets more and more picturesque until its infancy, when it was all poetry. The corruption of man was followed by corruption of his language, so that when the simplicity of his ideas was broken by the desire for wealth, power, and fame, no new images were created, and old words were perverted to stand for what was not. The wise man and the poet can pierce this rotted diction and attach words again to visible things. In demonstrating his third point about language, nature itself is the symbol of spirit. Emerson says that language is figurative because the whole of nature is a metaphor of the human mind. The laws of nature and of matter are the same. Principles of physics can be applied to ethics. For example, the whole is greater than its parts, or reaction is equal to action. And man's axioms are often drawn from nature, as a rolling stone gathers no moss, or a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. This relationship between mind and matter he sees as obvious and open to the minds of all men. He adds that when we finally ponder and discover this miracle, we have to wonder if we've been blind and deaf. As he states it, can these things be and overcome us like a summer's cloud without our special wonder? Now we come to the section of the essay in which Emerson talks about nature as a discipline. She is a discipline for understanding because from her we learn lessons on likeness and difference, being and seeming, and of progressive arrangement and the combinations of forces. Emerson speaks of space, time, society, labor, climate, food, locomotion, the animals, and the mechanical forces, all of which educate the understanding and the reason. Reason, as you may remember, is really Emerson's word for intuition. In the perception of differences, for instance, man learns there is space and time, and they are separate and individual. Just like the bell and a plow, each have their own use, and neither can do what the other does. And just like water, coal, or wool have separate uses. Understanding of such differences enables man to realize that every man is not like every other man. Nature also provides us a lesson in the exercise of will and in power, which can be seen in all events. The child learns, according to Emerson, the secret that he can reduce under his will not only particular events, but whole series of events, and so conform all facts to his character. Nature, to Emerson, is meant to serve man, offering all its raw materials for his chosen use. But man repeatedly reduces all things until the world becomes nothing but his realized will, as he puts it, a double of man. At this point, Emerson begins a discussion of how all things are moral. The forms, colors, and motions of nature suggest to man the laws of right and wrong, echoing the 10 Commandments. So nature becomes an ally of religion. Nature's character is seen as ethical because all of its ends are converted to new means. A thing is good only so far as it serves. Each natural process reflects a moral law. For instance, a farm, with its chaff and wheat, weeds and plants, blight, rain, insects, and sun, is a silent gospel. The moral influence of nature depends on how much truth an individual can extract from it, something that can only be measured by the individual himself. Then Emerson suggests that there is unity in the very variety of nature. Although on the surface there are superficial differences, underneath there is a likeness that prevails. As examples, he gives architecture as frozen music, and a Gothic church as a petrified religion, the latter quote having been taken from Coleridge. On the surface, architecture and music are unlike. On the surface, a building and a religion are unlike. But beneath this variety is unity. He sees this unity both in thought and in action. He says, an action is the perfection and publication of thought, and a right action has a likeness to all that is done rightly. Now the author moves on to idealism and nature. He raises the question, an ancient and noble question, as to whether nature outwardly exists, or whether it's an illusion or figment of the imagination. Whether what we call sun and moon, man and woman, house and trade, are only a certain number of sensations which coincide. He concludes that, first of all, he has no way to test the validity of his sensations, so it's a moot point. And second of all, what does it matter whether Orion is up in the heavens or some god has merely painted an image of him there? Whether it exists without or within, nature is still as useful and venerable to him. It is ideal to Emerson as long as he doesn't test the accuracy of his senses. Anyway, he says, the stability of nature is unaffected by such questions and doubts. And finally, such doubts probably have their own purpose, since they lead man to regard nature as a phenomenon, thus leading him to a more intuitive and spiritual interpretation of it. He states that nature herself teaches us this ideal philosophy, as he calls it. She conspires with spirit to emancipate us. He explains his idea this way. As we watch the shore from a moving ship, or as we cross town in a coach, the scene takes on a pictorial air, an unreal quality. Our vision, changed chiefly by motion, suggests the difference between us and what we see, and that difference is that we remain stable while the world appears to be a spectacle. To perceive this difference is to perceive that the soul, in man, is the center of the universe. The poet, too, expresses this ideal philosophy when he uses imagination to lift the material world into a higher sphere. He is not as limited as normal man, who sees everything through his senses. For example, Shakespeare, who possessed this power of intuition, writes about the most imposing phenomena of the world, and yet asserts the dominance of the soul. Emerson quotes from The Tempest to illustrate how Shakespeare unified all events and objects, because he perceived the unity in all of them. He says of Shakespeare, the remotest spaces of nature are visited, and the farthest sundered things are brought together by a subtle spiritual connection. Idea reigns supreme over matter to the philosopher too, but where the poet emphasizes beauty, the philosopher emphasizes truth. Emerson quotes Plato, who says of philosophy, it proceeds on the faith that a law determines all phenomena. That law is the idea. Therefore, the true poet and the true philosopher both impart a spiritual life to nature. Even in science and physics, the seemingly solid block of matter has been penetrated and dissolved by thought. Science has always been forced to doubt the existence of matter, because it's the idea itself that's most important in science. Through the realization that time and space are relations of matter, we understand the absolute and the immortal. Religion and ethics, he adds, are the practice of ideas. They put nature underfoot, degrading it, and suggesting it depends on spirit. Emerson then points out the difference between ethics and religion, saying the former sets forth duties that spring from man, and the latter sets forth duties springing from God. Religion is for the common people what formal philosophy is for the educated man, but both say the same thing. The things that are seen are temporary, things unseen are eternal. Idealism sees the world in God. He says, it beholds the whole circle of persons and things, of actions and events, of country and religion, not as painfully accumulated, atom after atom, act after act, in an aged creeping past, but as one vast picture, which God paints on the instant eternity for the contemplation of the soul. The advantage of the ideal theory over popular faith, he says, is that it presents the world in precisely that view which is most desirable to the mind. The next section of nature is about spirit. Emerson asserts that any theory about nature and of man must emphasize spirit, something beyond matter and the material world, towards which man is always reaching. If idealism only denies the existence of matter and leaves God out, it doesn't satisfy the demands of the spirit. God cannot be defined, but the material world of nature, including man, is the incarnation of God. The world proceeds from the same spirit as the body of man does. It's a more remote and inferior incarnation of God, but its serene order can't be violated and is therefore the present concrete example of the divine mind. The link between man and nature is that both are always tending toward the spiritual and absolute. The final section of the essay is about what Emerson terms prospects. He begins it by talking about man's failings, how he limits his powers, fails to contemplate, and is guided by empirical thought instead of intuition. Emerson says truth is not attained by mere addition and subtraction or other comparisons of known qualities, but by bursts of spirit and imagination in which a guess may be more valuable than an indisputable affirmation, and a dream more significant than 100 experiments. At present, man applies to nature only half his force. He works on the world with his understanding alone. It's as if a banished king should attempt to resume his power by buying his territory inch by inch, instead of vaulting at once into his throne. The problem of restoring the world its original and eternal beauty is solved by the redemption of the soul, whereby it will regain its lost unity. He says, "The invariable mark of wisdom is to see the miraculous in the common. What is a day? What is a year? What is a summer? What is a woman? What is a child? What is sleep?" While the abstract question occupies your intellect, nature brings it to a concrete level to be solved by your hands. He finishes his essay with this advice: "Every spirit builds itself a house, and beyond its house a world, and beyond its world a heaven. Build, therefore, your own world, and as fast as you conform your life to the pure idea in your mind, that world will unfold its great proportions." In this summary of Emerson's famous first essay, we've tried to distill some very complex thoughts and wordings to give you a clear idea of his general philosophy. Nevertheless, it might be helpful to review and interpret some of the key points of this work, since they are also key points in the Transcendental movement that so influenced 19th century writers and philosophers. First of all, Emerson and other Transcendentalists put their emphasis on intuition and rejected empirical thought as the means to truth. Empirical truths rely on practical and logical intelligence. Intuitive truths are absolute, transcend what is perceived by the senses, and are directly received. Second, he placed emphasis on self-reliance, the ability to trust one's intuitions and to trust one's impulse for gaining insight and revelation. Third, Emerson believed nature is a microcosm, as is man himself. Within each is the order, design, and detail that reflects the unity of the universe. By studying it and being in solitude with it, man can realize that unity. Emerson believed that by establishing a direct relationship with nature, one could attain insight and understanding into the purpose of the world and of man. Fourth, Emerson believes in a soul that pre-exists birth and comes from beyond. Fifth, he emphasizes spirit over matter. The material world, what is visible and tangible, is less important than the spiritual and intuited. Sixth, he states that spiritual facts are represented by natural symbols, and that this has affected, among other things, man's language. That language contains figurative speech that recognizes the connection between objects and events of nature and the condition of man. Finally, there is a basic morality in nature, and when man's conduct is moral, or lives up to the highest standards, he aligns himself with nature, and therefore with the spirit or godliness which pervades it. Nature was written very early in Emerson's career, but it contained all the seeds which later blossomed into a full, comprehensive philosophy of life, and was strong and compelling enough to, in itself, inspire his contemporaries and attract a wide, enthusiastic audience and many admirers. In this one essay, he addresses almost all the most profound and ancient questions that haunt mankind. What is matter? What is spirit, and how does it manifest? What is the purpose of man and his world? How can man conduct himself so that he can become more aligned with nature, God, and eternal truths?
This is the end of the session.